Good morning. I'm Padmapriya, Assistant Professor in Department of CSE in RMD Engineering College. Today we are going to see the topic on Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP, under the subject 21 CS 501, Computer Networks. Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP, is used to define how the client-server programs can be written to retrieve the web pages from the web. An HTTP client sends a request, and HTTP server returns a response. The server uses the port number 80. The client uses a temporary port number. HTTP uses the services of TCP, which is a connection-oriented and reliable protocol. This means that before any transaction between the client and the server take place, a connection needs to be established between them. After the transaction, the connection should be terminated. HTTP, prior to the version 1.1, specified non-persistent connections. In a non-persistent connection, one TCP connection is made for each request or response. The following list the steps in this strategy. The client opens a TCP connection and sends a request. The server sends a response and closes the connection. The client reads the data until it encounters an end of file marker. It then closes the connection. In this strategy, if a file contains links to n different pictures in different files, the connection must be opened and closed n+1 times. Now let us see the non-persistent strategy of HTTP. The non-persistent connection imposes high overhead on the server because the server needs n+1 different buffers each time a connection is opened. So now we can see how a non-persistent connection is established for each and every request and response. Now, a client requests a data from the server. So first, it sends a handshake message to the server. For this handshake message received from the client, the server will send a response, that is a second handshake. Now, the client will be sending the request along with the third handshake. Now, for this request, the server will be sending the response. And now, once a client receives the file, the client will be sending the first handshake, that message it received the file. And for this, server will be sending the second handshake, that is the response message. And this response message has been received by the client. So it indicates the server by sending the third handshake message. Now, this completes one connection for getting one file from the server. Now, the same way, if another one file or image or anything which we want to get it from the server, it is the same procedure that the client and server has to perform by the client sending the first handshake message to the server, and for this handshake, the server will be sending the response message, that is the second handshake, and for this, next, the client will be sending the third handshake along with its request. For this request, the response is being sent to the server, from the server to the client. And after getting the response, the client will be sending the first handshake, close the connection. And for this response, the server will be sending the second handshake. And for indicating the commit, the client will be sending the third handshake. For each connection, TCP requires at least 3 handshake messages to establish the connection, but the request can be sent with the third one only. After the connection is established, the object can be transferred. After receiving an object, another 3 handshake messages are needed to terminate the connection. This means that the client and the server are involved in 2 connection establishment and 2 connection terminations. For each connection, the client and the server need to allocate extra resources such as buffers and variables. This is another burden on both sides, but especially on the server side. Let us see about the persistent connection. HTTP version 1.1 specifies persistent connection by default. In a persistent connection, the server leaves the connection open for more requests after sending a response. The server can close the connection at the request of a client or if a timeout has been reached. The sender usually sends the length of the data which each response. However, there are some occasions when the sender does not know the length of the data. This is the case when a document is created dynamically or actively. In these cases, The server informs the client that the length is not known and closes the connection after sending the data. So the client knows that the end of the data has been reached. Time and resources are saved using persistent connections. Only one set of buffers and variables needs to be set for the connection at each site. The round trip time for connection establishment and connection termination is saved. So let us see the diagrammatic presentation of persistent connection. So for the connection establishment, the client will be sending the first handshake to the server. With this response, the server will be sending the second handshake to the client. Now the client will be sending the third handshake along with the request. Now the server will be sending the response. So next, instead of closing the connection, in persistent connection, the client is able to send the second request. And for it, once it gets the response. So after completing its request, sending its request and all from the client side, and after getting the response from the server, the client now, if it wants to close the connection, if there are no more requests means, it can close the connection by sending the first handshake to the server, followed by the second handshake from the server to the client, and third handshake from the client to the server. Thank you.